Hey guys, welcome back here inside the Palace Castle, and we're right in the middle of our study, the American Revolution, and I can't wait to discuss what we're going to talk about here this evening. In class, we already discussed a little bit about the Second Continental Congress, but I want to kind of dive into it a little bit more here this evening as we talk about some of the things that were going on in other parts, not just in Boston. We know that Boston was still under the control of the King's men, of the Redcoats, and one of the biggest things was trying to get Boston back. How could they release the people of Boston and get the Redcoats to evacuate the city? That was one of George Washington's main goals early in this war at the end of 1775 and early 1776. Now remember, the Continental Army really hadn't been set up yet. That was something that was still going on by George Washington, but the colonies hadn't united. Remember, they're still trying to avoid this war at all costs, and that's what we're going to talk about here this evening. We're going to take a look at the formation of the Second Continental Congress, what happens, and then, of course, something else that's happening at the same time in New York, and that is the Green Mountain Boys and what they do to actually try and get some more arms and ammunition, something that obviously the rebels are going to need throughout the war. So let's go ahead and get started here this evening. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the Green Mountain Boys and the formation of the Second Continental Congress. But first, let's take a look at what was happening with these men that we call the Green Mountain Boys. As you see here behind me, we've got the Green Mountain Boys flag. And this story is kind of interesting because one of the men who are going to be kind of helping in this whole ordeal was a guy who was literally just a member of the British regime, like seriously, not 6 months before this. Not Ethan Allen, but the guy who's going to help him, and we'll get to him in just a second. But a Vermont blacksmith by the name of Ethan Allen is going to be the leader of this ragtag group of farmers with pitchforks. Again, a militia. And they come up with this idea to surprise attack Fort Ticonderoga, one of the British forts on the southern tip of Lake Champlain, a beautiful place. I get a chance to go to Lake Champlain. It's one of the beautiful places to visit in the Northeast, but it was a great strategic place for the British. And they had a very big, large storehouse of weapons and arms inside of this fort. And so they were going to try and take this, and so that they could have some weapons, cannons especially, and eventually we're going to use these cannons and things that they have to try and take back Boston. So here's a map behind me of Lake Champlain Basin. You can see kind of where it's located, New York, Vermont, that area. And of course, we're talking about towards the southern tip here of Fort Ticonderoga. And the guy that is going to help Ethan Allen was General Benedict Arnold. Now, he becomes a general for the Continental Army, but he was actually working for the British, again, not too far before this. And he was kind of the catalyst of trying to get some of the British who were around that area to trust, even though that he was really spying on them and trying to help out Ethan Allen. So he becomes a major factor in how they are successful at capturing Fort Ticonderoga. They did it really late at night. The story goes that they kind of went in. Supposedly there weren't many guards at the front. They saw a guy sleeping, and they just kind of walked right in the door, or the gate of the fort, and were able to literally knock on the door of the captain who was in charge of the fort, and without really any battle whatsoever. The British had to surrender the fort pretty quickly, and along with that went all of the quantities of cannons and gunpowder. Remember, black powder was very, very needy in the colonies because, of course, the king and General Gage, of course, in Boston was trying to make sure that the colonists couldn't get a hold of it. They stopped selling it. They stopped bringing it in from Europe. And so it was very hard to find. And so any time that they could find guns and cannons and gunpowder was going to be successful for the colonies, because Washington would need that as they moved forward with the war. So now the siege of Boston. We already know from everything that we've watched and talked about in class and discussed before that Boston has been taken over, all right, by martial law, by General Gage. And one of the major things that wanted to happen was to get it back. And so over the winter of 1775 and 76, Colonel Henry Knox, all right, is going to carry 60 tons of Fort Ticonderoga's artillery over 300 miles. Now, I want you to think about that and how long that's going to take. 60 tons over 300 miles. And it's not like we have, big things to take it. They couldn't just take it down the water because there's no waterway from Fort Ticonderoga over to Boston. So they obviously had to do this with animals, donkeys and horses and oxen and things of that nature to try and get these things. And of course, marching these cannons as well all the way to Boston. And so it didn't happen until the following spring that everything arrived. And that's when George Washington was able to force the British to evacuate the city. And we're going to talk about how that happens and how he kind of surprises Boston by pointing everything at the city of Boston and pretty much making a threat that George Washington would have gone on had they not evacuated the city. And so, yes, in the March of 1776, the American rebels were able to break the stalemate, and it caused the British to evacuate the city. And of course, the British will tell you that they were going after Sam Adams again, and that they were going after trying to end this war before it ever began. Because now the British know that we mean business. We know that the war has happened, okay? We know the Declaration of Independence is going to be signed because at the same time, the Second Continental Congress is already convened, and that's what we're going to talk about next. What actually happened in Philadelphia at the end of 1775 and going into 1776? What exactly happened? Because, of course, we met the first time. And in the first time that they were trying to figure out a way to, number one, avoid the war, try to get the king to repeal all these dumb taxes, and it didn't work out. So now the Second Continental Congress, which was obviously kind of the catalyst of Benjamin Franklin again in Philadelphia, are going to bring back all the members and representatives. This time, more people are involved. All 13 colonies are represented here at the Second Continental Congress. And these delegates are now going to decide what to do. And they're going to try one last time, one last plea to try and get King George III to end all of these stupid acts and to, because that's what the colonies said. If you'll just repeal the acts, give us representation, the war won't happen, we'll stop, and everything will be fine. But and they sent this olive branch petition. It was the last ditch effort. And they said, hey, we're going to declare our loyalty to you. As long as you get rid of these intolerable acts, give us Boston back, we'll stop the war. And, it was this whole idea of e pluribus unum. Of course, you see it on the presidential seal, as you see behind me, of out of many. All right, there's one. And so when you think about it, out of many colonies, they want to become one. Out of many ideas, there wants to be one. And so they were literally saying to the king, look, we are on our last string. If you don't do it now, then there will be war. Of course, the king receives the olive branch petition. He laughs at it, throws it up, or throws it away, tears it up, burns it, whatever. He ignores it, and he declines to repeal the intolerable acts. And so as you see here behind me, all the signatures of all the men and delegates who were there. And it's interesting because you see this, and you see the names like John Hancock and some of the people who were involved. These same names are going to be the same ones that are going to be put on the Declaration of Independence when that's the next step that they decide to do. And so, of course, all these men here, now King thinks, or the King George III thinks, that these men are considered treasonous, and they are. And had the war ended in a different fashion with the Americans not winning, these men right here probably would have been hanged to death for committing treason towards their country. And so after he refused to repeal the intolerable acts, the delegates decided to immediately, we must set up our Continental Army. And who better to do that and to create it and to lead it than General George Washington? And that's exactly what happened. The delegates asked George Washington to continue his creating the military, creating the army, and they asked all 13 colonies to come together, to be one, that the delegates from each colony would fund this Continental Army. Now, the problem was, were there going to be enough trained people? Could George Washington be able to train enough people in time before the king sends over thousands upon thousands of troops? And that's what's going to be the most important factor. Okay, well, that'll about do it for this episode here. of Historia Mystoria, and I hope you understand a little bit about what happened in 1775 and the Second Continental Congress. Now, of course, the next step we're going to be talking about is the Declaration of Independence. We're going to introduce you to Thomas Jefferson and a little bit about why he was chosen and what some of the things were in there as well. So we took a look at that on Friday in class, and we'll kind of have a little bit more information on that later this week. So again, until you have to click on one of my lessons again here on Historia Mystoria, I'm Professor Dwayne Sponseller. Until next time, we'll see you. Have a great night.